is Dominique Bourrat. I'm professor at the Economic Warfare School in Paris. And I have around me four speakers. Sébastien, whom I'm going to present in a few minutes. And we have 3 speakers who are going to participate remotely. So we have today Clara Jordan, David Van Duren, Sébastien Rocher, and Caroline Train. So Clara is going to be the first speaker. We address today the breathtaking question of cybersecurity maturity indices. Are they useful? They are designed to rank states on their capacity to apprehend and respond to cyber threats. These indices are multiplying, and we're interested today to understand on what criteria do they base their diagnosis and what do they really assess. Are they even reliable, these indices? Are they really useful? For example, can they be used by the insurance or financial sector to assess the robustness of a state or a company? So it's quite critical to have precise answer today on this topic. Clara Jordan is Chief Public Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute. The mission of this institute, as it is presented, is to enhance the stability of cyberspace. The work of Clara in this institute is to decrease the frequency, impact, and scale of cyber attacks by sophisticated actors that have significant and direct harm on civilians and or civilian infrastructure. So Clara, you work for greater transparency about these attacks with the aim of holding malicious actors to account for the harm for the harm they cause. So that's the presentation, the official presentation of your institution online. So maybe you can elaborate on that, first of all, and maybe say a few words about your background, introduce yourself properly, and then we can start to address the topic. So with your permission, I'll feel free to interrupt you with some questions, should they occur. And you have basically 10 minutes for your presentation. I assume you don't use PPT presentation. Can you confirm that? Okay, so the floor is yours, all yours. Clara.
Thank you very much, yep. And good morning. I hope you can all hear me. No presentation today. I think we're already stretching the limits of interacting as humans via technology. So I'll try to make it as easy as possible. So again, thank you for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Clara Jordan, and I'm the Chief Public Policy Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute. The Cyber Peace Institute is an NGO. We are based in Geneva with a global team. And as you mentioned, our mission is to work to increase accountability in cyberspace for cyber attacks. In our work, we are focusing on vulnerable population, and really we are looking at the impact that harms cause to the victims of cyber attacks. We have seen over the years that it's the national security, foreign policy, and economic narrative and focus on technical aspects of cybersecurity, which of course are all important. But we feel that at the end of the day, technology is there to improve the human condition. It's here to better our lives. But in order for us to unlock the potential of the technology, we feel that it has to be safe, secure, trustworthy, and at peace. And so we are doing different strands of work to do it. Just very briefly on Cyber Peace Institute, we operate in the ecosystem with partners, and we have 3 main strands of work, which is analysis, advancement, assistance. And we have a beautiful graphic which shows you how these sort of work in a cycle, in an ecosystem, where we have analytical capability that helps us understand the real facts on the ground and that what's happening to victims. We have assistant teams that's helping these victims based on what we know that is happening to them. We also match resources from the industry to these victims and then help them increase their resilience. And then we use this evidence we have to do that evidence-led work and evidence-led advocacy in a team which is called Advancement, and is the team I'm leading at the Institute. Just very briefly on my background, I spent my career going back and forth, as many of us, between the industry, the not-for-profit community, think tanks, and an international organization. I work for the Global Cyber Alliance, for a company called FireEye, for a company called BlackBerry. I worked at the Atlantic Council, and I started my career as a lawyer at NATO. So with that, let me jump into the question of the presentation, which we all know it's a very difficult, complicated one. And I know there's been a lot of great minds who've put a lot of time and effort in trying to understand the indices indicator, their usefulness. And I really commend those organizations who spent a decade plus thinking about it, because it is a very, very complicated question. So, you know, for me as a practitioner, you know, I look at it and I say, well, are they useful for what? So I think that question is important to answer in a lot of the context, a lot of the conversations. You know, from my perspective, and I'll start sort of at the high level and then talk about some of the details. You know, from my perspective, they can be very helpful and a very powerful tool to accountability of different actors in our ecosystem. If we understand that a country had an area where it had to take certain steps required to improve its cybersecurity posture, and they don't, should that fact, should that information be used to think about how we can hold them accountable? In our work, we see and perceive and witness that, you know, it's really that lack of accountability that is responsible for the huge portion of what we are witnessing today, especially on the side of states who are not being held accountable for their acts of omission and who are not fulfilling their responsibilities to protect their citizens. So, you know, I think that's a
Clara,
very important.
Excuse me, I have a question concerning the aim of your institution. I understand that it's very human-centric. It's focused on victims. It's focused, as you said, on human rights. Should we understand that it's at the citizen level, or do you include as well the impact on companies, economic impact, or is it focused specifically on human rights, on citizens?
Thank you for that question. You know, we are looking at it from really the harm caused to individuals. Very specifically, we've tracked attacks on the healthcare sectors to see actually, you know, what is the harm caused to people? You know, how do the individuals suffer when attack or ransomware or other disruption of provision of care occurs? When you look at the coverage, you know, we're focusing very much on, you know, how do we technically, you know, reinstate the services, you know, who was the actor, but we're really not looking at what harm it realistically caused to society. Obviously, economic harm is a very important part of the societal harm. So if we're looking at it comprehensively, obviously, you know, the economic harm is important. You know, the national security harm is very important. But really what we feel is really, you know, missing from the discourse today and from the metrics and the data is to understand harm on individuals. We are ambitious and we strive to go as far in our future work as to understand, you know, how do you think about psychological harm? You know, if you couldn't get a surgery or your private data is lost, or your private conversations with your therapist about, you know, your trauma and abuse is being published, what is it actually causing to you as an individual?
Do you have a kind of role to influence the creators, the developers of indices in order to integrate more these human parameters? Because then we have a lot of indices in the index itself, a lot of parameters to take in account, like technical ones, of course, and maybe we focus too much on technical issues or economic issues, and maybe less I'm speaking under your control, maybe less on the impact on human and civil rights. So are you developing a kind of lobbying in order to integrate more and better these parameters in indices?
Yes, so indeed. So our advocacy work and our outreach work is based on the evidence we're seeing. But perhaps I should mention that with two of our partners who I believe are present there today, with Jode and the Hague Center for Security Studies, we are co-leading a group that's operationalizing the work group 5 of the Paris call process. And we're actually looking at those sort of cyber stability. How would we build cyber stability index? And we're looking at what indices would help us to understand, whether their cyberspace is stable. We're developing a methodology which we're hoping the others will use, but within that methodology, part that we're looking at is how would we measure, how would we get a better understanding of the consequences of a cyber attack on an individual. I would like to also mention that we've participated in the ransomware task force that was launched in the United States, and as you've probably all seen, the work of the task force will be continuing, and even within the previous work and going forward, hopefully, we'll be actually focusing on developing that methodology to track that societal impact and harm of cyber attacks specifically from ransomware. Again, we feel that there is a lot of policy and technical level conversations, and they are missing that that important element to understand the impact. What we have seen and noticed and trying to work on in our advocacy and analytical work is that data is not even available on this kind of attacks. I think we collectively know as a community how much data, more generally in cybersecurity, was important to address a lot of these issues. The indices, the indicator, the CI is stopped in cybersecurity control. We know how much those measurements sort of help develop, the right policies, or at least, I don't think there's such a thing as a right policy in cybersecurity, at least policies that are helping us to manage threat, or, that at least have the ambition. But we are very much missing that on this human aspect of cybersecurity.
So I understand that it's really interdisciplinary, and you need to work with different capacities, different expertise, and create synergies between these experts in order to get to what you are looking for. That's to say, an increased stability of the cyberspace. In order to protect better the individuals and the civilian interest. Clara, could you just wrap up your very interesting presentation with 2 or 3 takeaways for the audience, because I know that in such conference it's very important to have like really key points or punchlines or key takeaways, because we have so many solicitations here in FIC. It's huge, many conferences. So in order to remember to have this understanding, precise understanding, and so it's all yours for
I think
3 key takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, for me, the key takeaway, even for the conversation with the group, and I'm looking forward to hearing their take is, I think there are certain limitations of these indicators and indices and what we should do with them. I think the key is to address those, how the indicator and indices can be a helpful tool for the decision makers. We get so much wrapped up in methodologies and taxonomies for all good reasons. But I think, how do we address and understand, how we can use, how decision maker use this? For us, really, there's the need for that decision based on reliable evidence, especially around the societal harms. I also think that the country maturity indices and indexes, I think they have a lot to learn from measurements around cybersecurity, and how that thinking was done. And perhaps one warning, that I like to sort of, or my sort of point of caution, when we think about the indices and measurements in general in cybersecurity, what I've seen is that they mostly rely and they account for a static threat. We think that, we're developing something that takes such a long time to develop that the threat landscape continues. We've seen it in cybersecurity measurement. We say, implement top 10 CIS controls while you lower your threat by 80%. But that's a static number, and threat is not static. So I think in the conversations of indications measurement, can we use it for insurance? Can we use it for other things? I would really like to see a conversation by this community, or how do we account for the threat landscape and evolving threat landscape, which is not static. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Clara, for this takeaways. The next speaker is, okay, you stay online with us, Clara, and we'll come back to you, of course, during the presentations. You will be able to interact, and at the end for a conclusion, short conclusion that you will give. So the next speaker is David van Durel. Okay, hi David, welcome.
Hello.
Nice to have you on the panel today. So David, you are director of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. This forum on cyber expertise is a global platform for countries, international organizations, and private companies to exchange best practices and expertise on cyber capacity building. The aim of your entity is to identify successful policies, practices, and ideas, and multiply this on a global level together with partners from NGOs, the tech community, and academia. Okay, maybe you're going to elaborate a bit on your entity.
Okay.
Give some background element on yourself, and then you have 10 minutes for your presentation. And if you allow me,
okay.
I'll be able to interrupt you for some questions. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Dominic, and also thank you for having me on this important panel. Unfortunately, I will join this meeting online, just like Clara, but I hope to see you all in person at the FIC conference next year. I really enjoyed the last years being on the FIC conference. So for the next 10 minutes, I will talk about the importance of national cyber capacity assessments, different types that countries use, and the use of assessments in our current African Union GFC project for the African region. So first, I would like to introduce the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. You did quite a good job already, Dominique. Maybe for others, the GFC was established in 2015. And back then, the global community gathered at the Global Conference on Cyberspace. And they started to see an emerging need to bridge the gap between policymakers and capacity building experts and implementers, and to build up structures, networks to support global cyber capacity building efforts. And the domain was growing. And that's, that was the background, and I think it's still the case. So a global, informal, neutral platform was thought to be the best way to achieve this. So a new platform, I think the most important thing being a neutral platform. What did we do? Build a community to raise awareness, and basically the aim is to share knowledge and enable practical implementation of capacity building. So that's in a nutshell how the GFC was born, as a coordinating platform for cyber capacity building, being multi-stakeholder, flexible and action-oriented. And currently we have around 130 members and partners, like you said, countries, private companies, international organizations, but also, and that's really important, for the last 3 years, we added a lot of what we call partners, but implementing organizations who have the real knowledge on cyber capacity building. With the GFC community, we set up structures, networks to support and facilitate cyber capacity building efforts. And we call it the GFC ecosystem for cyber capacity building. And central in this ecosystem are 5 GFC working groups. And these are really the engine of the GFC. It's a place where members and partners, policymakers and implementers, and content and process really comes together. We also created over the years some mechanisms and tools to support cyber capacity building, like our Sybil portal. It's a big portal with over 700 examples of, projects, best practices, tools on cyber capacity building. It's public, it's open to everyone, and with our members and partners, we build this Sybil portal. Secondly, the clearinghouse, that's a mechanism to offer support for individual needs of countries. And we have a global research agenda to fill in existing knowledge gaps that the community sees.
David,
the overall aim...
David, if I may ask you a question. You mentioned this strategic partnership between GFCE and the African Union. I would like to know if you have some interactions with ITU on that regard. We have Caroline speaking on this panel after you from ITU. Do you have some kind of interaction based on the fact that ITU is proceeding to ranking at the African continent level? So maybe there is some overlap or some complementarities between your work and the work of ITU, and how do you use that? It's a beautiful example, I think.
So we have our project with the AU. What we do with this project is to identify needs of all 55 African countries. And the first starting point, because what we aim for is to find out what are the needs. And the first starting point are making use of existing assessment tools. And one of them is the ITU, the GCI index of ITU. And even more important, now it's renewed lately. So this is one of the assessments. But our strategy was to make use of, ITU is a member of the GFCE, the World Bank is a member of the GFCE, and there are also a lot of members who also have an index or an assessment. So what we did was to make use of the different. We took like 5 assessments to make use of them to get sort of a first picture. And I will tell you a little bit more about it. Maybe I can take one step back, and then I will come back to that and also to our African project. So maybe, back to the topic of today. Are country maturity indices useful? My answer would be yes. And it's not because I think so, but also because this is one of the topics that the GFC identified in 2017 as one of the most relevant topics in regard to cyber capacity building. And national cyber assessments was one of them. And within the GFC you have a working group that brings policymakers and implementers together to sharing information on national cyber assessments. We see national cyber assessment, so why is it important or useful? National cyber capacity assessment tools can be seen as a starting point for a country to get a clear picture. Where are they right now? What capacities are in place? What are gaps? What investments to make, or have the discussion at least? And a lot of countries use assessments as a first step in their effort to develop a national cybersecurity strategy. If we look at the members and partners of the GFC, they use different assessments tools. And one example is of an assessment that has been used a lot within the GFCE is the CMM, the Cybersecurity Capacity Assessment Maturity Model of the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center in Oxford. And this assessment gives a broad picture on existing and missing capacities and is often input for national cybersecurity strategies. Recently, and that's maybe also important for people who are listening, I would like to suggest you to check out like our civil portal. Our working group on policy and strategy has developed a document. It's called the GOAT, a global overview of existing national cyber capacity assessment tools. And within this document, we gave an overview on 8 tools developed by and used by different GFC members and partners to assess countries' cyber capacity. So one of them, you already mentioned, is the GCI of ITU, but others include combating cybercrime. It's a capacity building tool of the World Bank that really focused on cybercrime. Also a cyber maturity in the Asia Pacific region by OSPI. It's a Knowledge Institute from Australia. The Cyber Readiness Index from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, really focusing on the big developed countries, like G20 countries. The CMM I just mentioned. Also from the United States, the MITRE Corporation has its own cyber strategy development and implementation framework. ITU is mentioned, and we have from Europe the National Capabilities Assessment Framework from ENISA, and last but not least, the National Cybersecurity Index from the e-Government Academy in Estonia. Maybe some observations on these assessment tools, if you look at them. There's not a best one, so to say. The needs of a specific country are leading and making the choice of one or even more of these assessments. Most of these assessments have a lot of overlap on content. If you look at it, covering a lot of topics that you also see in national strategies like CERT development, awareness raising, CIP, critical infrastructure protection, or cyber skills and culture.
David, you mentioned overlap. Should we understand coordination or cooperation between different indices, and that there should be room for improvement in that regard? What's your opinion on that?
I think yes and no, I would say. I think it would make, I think several organizations have had the same idea with their own perspective to develop an index. And there are some differences in these indexes. Also, the methodology is different. So it's also about a certain country, what they like. I think it makes sense, and that's what we try within the GFCE, to sort of bring these indices together. That's what we did also with this study, with this document. Also to pinpoint, what's specific on an assessment, and a country itself can make a choice. So some assessments are, documents, sort of self-assessments. Others are working with experts that come in for a couple of weeks doing interviews. One are more, quantitative, other more qualitative. So there are some differences between these indexes. At the same time, I think also on a regional level, there are some. We probably see some specific assessments coming up that, for example, suit a certain region. But like to answer your question, I think in general it would make sense to at least bring together these different tools and pinpoint, see what are what's in common within these assessments, and also what are the differences to make it more insightful for users.
Okay, thank you, David. In order to wrap up your presentation, can you give us 2 key takeaways, like Clara did, in order to have kind of summarize or punchline?
Yeah, one thing is, I think if you look at assessments, they are just a starting point for a discussion. So I think this is one important thing, and the second thing is to realize that some of the outcomes are not up to date. So sometimes we work with assessments that have been done years ago. You can miss, if you talk to a country, you find out that there are maybe some local assessments in another language that are not taken into account into account by existing assessments. And also maybe some assessments have a methodology or are developed for developed countries, for example, within Europe or the US, and on the basis of their capacity needs, and it doesn't have to be the same needs as, for example, in a region like Africa.
Okay,
so maybe, these are the takeaways.
Thank you, David. You stay online, and you will have 2 minutes conclusion at the end of the panel. The next speaker is Sébastien. He's with us.
Hello,
with us today. Welcome, Sébastien. So you are a corporate internal IT security auditor, but maybe you have a more precise definition of your task.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, I'm very glad to be in front of you for this speech and to be a part of this panel regarding cyber rating. So I'm Sebastian. I'm working at Orange corporate level, and I'm part of an Orange expert security community. And I have been looking at, let's say, the cyber rating trend. Definitely, it's a huge trend we have foreseen today, which is impacting, I think, two different ecosystems. Let's say we can see some rating at country level with some very interesting work done by, let's say, the ITU with the CGI and other initiatives that has been developed previously. But I would like today to focus much more about the trend concerning the company level. Let's say that rating is a very powerful communication element in order to answer a big challenge for the, let's say, the cyber security community, which is how do I assess or qualify or quantify the cyber risk? And how am I sharing that risk to, let's say, board or to non-technical people? And we can see a business need, and there is an obvious parallel to the credit rating. In the previous century, maybe you are all aware that credit rating was a key, let's say, trend for the previous century, and we have seen some major stakeholders managing the model. Here we can see Moody's or Standard & Poor's and so on. From an Orange perspective, and personally, I'm pretty sure that this century will be dedicated to the cyber rating. We will see, let's say, models assessing, let's say, the cyber risk challenge, and let's say this race, because we can see it's a business need and we can see a race. This race has already started. I would like just to emphasize or to highlight, that today most of the models are coming from the US, and for sure we have a sovereignty issue. Do we accept to be assessed by a non-European stakeholder?
Maybe, Sebastian, we can be very clear. I'm going to ask you a straightforward question.
Yeah.
Might the cybersecurity assessment be an economic warfare tool?
Of course, yeah. First of all, yeah, it's a really key question from the geopolitical perspective. You are completely right to highlight this point, and we could believe that maybe if a US stakeholder who would like to degrade the confidence in some European industry will degrade, let's say, the indicator. But on top of that, from an Orange perspective, we believe that it's today necessary to have this kind of indicator. So we can see those two, I would like really to distinguish this trend at two levels. The first level that has been a little bit mentioned previously is the assessment of the country. But here I will mainly focus on the assessment on the company. And today I think most of the model we are foreseeing are non-standardized model. We don't see a collective work regarding how are we collecting technical facts. Do we accept to have a rating also? I mean,
without being
without being informed or without being
stakeholder of it.
Absolutely, yeah. Because today,
so it comes from outside.
I would like just to invite the people here to look at that trend, and maybe the business you are, let's say, responsible for is currently assessed by some, let's say, cyber rating agency, and maybe you are not aware that this kind of indicator is built and shared in the background.
And they might be done by foreign entities,
absolutely,
close to competitors.
Yeah.
Let's be clear about that. I mean, it's
absolutely.
a real issue.
It's a real issue, and it could be seen as a soft power, let's say, element in terms of, let's say, economical warfare.
Yeah, I like your vision of, you mentioned it, we had some talk before, and you said, when you said that soft power, I think it's quite appropriate.
Absolutely.
In our topic, yeah.
So we can see a clear sovereignty issue, but the point is to also, and from an Orange perspective, our behavior is to be seen as a trusted partner and to give the keys for the digital world. And we believe that the cyber rating is really a key for that digital world. And we believe that we need more standardization on that topic, and maybe to have more collective work regarding, let's say, how are we building, let's say, a rating, based on which facts, based on which law also, and it's really an issue we would like to highlight for today.
Maybe Sébastien, could you say a few words about Orange, because we made the assumption that everybody knows. Of course, everybody knows Orange, but it's a very powerful group with a lot of activities abroad on a lot of countries. So maybe it might be good to have some figures rapidly in order to.
Yeah, absolutely. So Orange is, let's say, a Western Europe-based company present worldwide, but managing telco infrastructure, mainly mobile domain. We are also covering business in the bank domain, and today we are also, let's say, working on the cybersecurity area, of course, with Orange Cyber Defense. But today, just to highlight that we can see that the business is more and more using, let's say, the cyber rating information. And today, the business does not have time to open discussion for clarifying what does it mean. It's taking the information like this for taking decision, maybe from an RFP perspective. It could be, let's say, it could be impacting also the business relationship. So today, we can see that it's really growing. It's really, we can see a huge adoption by the market of such kind of indicator. And but the current model are quite proprietary, potentially non-reliable model. And I think there is a key issue about the weightage of the fact.
Let's be clear, it might be biased.
Yes.
Clearly, I mean, on purpose.
Yes.
In order to get to some results.
Yes.
And to look for certain kind of impact in the framework of this soft power warfare.
Correct. Absolutely. You're completely right, Dominique. So, for instance, to be clear, if we would like to highlight maybe some, let's say, weakness of the current model, from the telco perspective, we have some risk associated to some key protocols like the SS7, but the current cyber rating trend are not covering that kind of risk, which are the heart of our business. And today, we are focusing on that area, for instance.
And Orange is in the top 10 operators in the world. I mean,
sure.
It's like,
yeah,
it's a huge...
Absolutely, and we have been working on that risk at the GSMA level and so on, but
I would like
just to highlight that the current model are not focusing on the risk associated to each, let's say, industry, or on the main cyber risk associated to each industry. So the reliability is a key point today, and the accuracy also of the technical fact is a key point. Because at the end of the day, we can see that cyber rating is interesting, if it's correct. And today, we have to say that from a telco perspective, we can see a lot of bias associated to the cyber rating.
So Sebastian, I understand that there might be some bias in the development of these assessments, but
Yes.
there might be some issues concerning the reliability of the technological assessment methodology or assessment tools.
Yes.
Is that correct? I mean,
Yeah.
we might have an issue
Yes.
even with the technological approach
Absolutely, yeah.
of
Yeah.
this.
Because, for instance, from a scope definition, when we are building a rating, we need to define a scope, of course. But due to the fact that the current trends are not asking a clear scope definition, automatically you can have some bias at the end of the day from the rating perspective.
Would you say that your company, for example, would have a different assessment than a competitor on a specific technology issue in
Sure.
terms of risk assessment?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So here, in fact, from an Orange perspective, we like just to highlight that the whole European industry is facing this trend, which could have huge impact, and it's not a concern just for Orange, it's a concern for the whole industry, definitely. And one maybe purpose, or one, let's say, proposal I would like to highlight is we are pushing for some charter in order to ask transparency, to be aware that a rating has been built, for instance, because we don't have the guarantee that today everyone is aware that a rating is produced, for instance. So we are pushing for a charter, we are pushing for more standardization, and we are pushing also for a political answer due to the sovereignty concern associated to the cyber rating aspect.
When you say political answer, you think about national answer or
Yeah, it could be national.
like European answer?
Absolutely.
Maybe ENISA?
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, look at the credit rating story. Credit rating story has been managed by Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and it was following the subprime crisis that Europe has been created, let's say, a body, which is ESMA, in order to look at the credit rating outcomes. Maybe we need something similar associated to the cyber rating
So
aspect.
it's a kind of monitoring of what's
Monitoring
going on.
and controlling, yeah, because
Controlling,
the impact of this, the impact of the cyber rating is huge today, because this indicator could be used by investor, by insurance, it could be seen by your partner, so you can look,
investors and so on.
and so on. And that's why today I believe that we have the time to discuss regarding the methodology at country level, but it's becoming much more urgent to work at the methodology, or to have an agreement of the methodology at company level, because we don't have time. Business does not have so much time for, let's say, in order to understand and in order to capitalize on the cyber rating.
So you mean that there might be a decorrelation between the political time in terms of building this or organizing this controlling these assessments,
Sure.
and the needs of the companies who need to take action now.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Yeah, absolutely.
what you see around you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have a question concerning your group. You have a lot of activities. In order to connect the dots with the previous speakers, you have a lot of activities in Africa. Do you
Absolutely.
speak with bodies like GFCE? Are you interested to interact with them since you are in charge of security community? So
Absolutely.
you are used to talk with very different organizations, people. So GFCE might be...
Absolutely, and the work done by the ITU is quite remarkable
ITU.
also, because it's something we can capitalize in terms of methodology, which is not considering just the technical part, and but I believe that Caroline will highlight the points a little bit.
Yeah, she will be the next speaker. And concerning Clara Jordan from CPI,
Yeah.
she mentioned this very strong concern for human rights and civilian impact of cybersecurity concern, since Orange Group has a very ethical concern as well, it might be good to have some kind of virtuous interaction with CPI.
It's
not
absolutely, and it's a collective concern. I mean, to have a reliable indicator and to have a common agreement about the methodology and the outcomes is definitely a collective work that need to be managed maybe at country level, at European level, and from a worldwide level.
So that would be your key takeaway, like synergize this assessment topic.
Absolutely,
and create as much cooperation as possible.
Yeah, and because we need this information today is definitely something we need to look at, and maybe it could be a point for ISO from the standardization level. It could be something, let's say, that could be foreseen by the ISO. And okay, I think is the one of the key things.
Thank you for this second takeaway about ISO. It's very interesting. So maybe we could come back on this ISO question. The next speaker is Caroline Trail. Hi, Caroline. Nice.
Hello.
Very excited to welcome you. We talked a lot about ITU before your speech. So shortly, ITU is the United Nations Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. It's driving innovation in ICTs together with 193 members, so it's really worldwide. What else can be said? And you work with 900 companies, so you're going to maybe elaborate on that. It's quite breathtaking. Universities, international and regional organizations. So, Caroline, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone, the fantastic organizing team. I got pinged, as the Brits say, with a COVID exposure notification. I just really want to compliment the team for immediately being able to adapt. I think adaptation is one of the key themes around cybersecurity, so thank you.
We had this interaction late at night yesterday, just to know our little secrets.
And Sebastian, I just want to touch on what you noted around cybersecurity ratings. I don't know if you've been exposed to the Boston-based firm BitSight. They're trying to create some sort of cybersecurity ratings, and the ITU has worked with them especially during the start of COVID-19, but we still do some work with them, where we helped countries use their rating to pinpoint where there were quick wins in terms of critical infrastructure. They create essentially a credit score for different countries, industries, and businesses. So they may be of interest for you for future exploration, but we can take that offline. Since I stand between us and the discussion moving forward, I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief. And I think we can all be in agreement that an index or maturity measure can be useful in helping to distill when we have a range of different measures. Some are qualitative, some are quantitative, and to help us place appropriate emphasis on where we want to track change. But a key theme that has already come up here is that these indices are just a starting point. They're not the end point. And as Clara pointed out, cybersecurity and technology as a whole, it's not static. So how do we then create indices that can measure change over time in a meaningful way that is also understandable? And I think this is very important because if we want to make real impact, we want to make it so that people can understand what these numbers mean and why they matter. And also on top of this, there's the challenge of by the time a lot of this is published or publicly available, the data is already out of date. My first index exposure was I was working on the Digital Evolution Index at the Fletcher School of Tufts University back in 2014. It's now known as the Digital Intelligence Index. And we were trying to track digital change back to from the introduction of the iPhone to 2015 at that point. And we found that many metrics simply didn't exist over time or weren't measured over time. So you had these incredibly interesting snapshots, but you weren't able to really say what is going on and what are the relationships. Reliable and comparable data collection, especially in developing countries, is a persistent ongoing challenge. which is why I find working on the Global Cybersecurity Index really interesting, because our mandate of 193 member states and the state of Palestine means that we work directly with countries to collect some of this data. And we collect its tertiary answers in case anybody's interested, yes, partial, or no. We're hoping to expand that in the future to be a little bit more nuanced. And when you work with such a broad range of respondents, you really have to be clear about how do we then make this comparable? How is this law in one country comparable to another? And that's something that I think there's more work to be done on, we're improving on. Because ultimately, what the ITU is focused on is to help spur broad cybersecurity change at the country level and help move those commitments forward. It's a little bit challenging at times, I'll admit, because the Global Cybersecurity Index, it doesn't necessarily mean that an individual in that country is more cyber secure. What it means is that the country is taking more actions. It's a little bit like trying to explain to somebody a healthy lifestyle. You're setting yourself up for success. You're making sure you have your running shoes, your vegetables, you're ready to make healthy choices. But we're not necessarily able to directly impact your cholesterol levels, how many eclairs you're offered, underlying health issues. But saying, are you taking those commitments to be on that journey and create a healthier ecosystem in this case? And so communicating that and communicating that local context is important, which is where I think indices often fall short. And there's also the challenge that when we focus on a specific metric, like do you have a specific law in place? Do you have a computer incident response team? Are we understanding the context in which that metric sits and how effective that metric is? I do want to take a little bit of a tangent here and note that sometimes countries will try to game the system. I think we've seen this with other indices. Think about the Doing Business Index by the World Bank and the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. If you put a metric out there and companies make investment decisions or aid decisions based on them, countries are going to say, is there a way that I can achieve some of these as quickly as possible without necessarily needing to revamp my entire ecosystem? And then, as part of this, we also have the challenge that it's easy for people to get lost in those numbers. And so index creators...
Excuse me, Karen,
sorry,
should we understand that there might be some room for twisting the results of these assessments, to be clear?
Yeah, I think that is something we need to think about. How reliable are the responses that are gathered there and how comparable are they?
Do you agree with that concept of weaponization of assessments, like in terms of economic warfare, that states or companies might use indices in order to develop an economic warfare?
I don't know if I'd go as far to call it weaponization, but it is certainly a form of soft power. And we have seen with even the Global Cybersecurity Index, countries are very quick to promote when they do well and to use that as part of their national narrative.
This word is very, I like it, narrative. I think it's the storytelling is a key topic in our subject today, right? Narrative, storytelling.
Very much, and I think this is where the challenge of what can the data tell us and what can't it tell us. Here, COVID, I think, has actually been helpful because depending on how you look at various COVID numbers, they can tell you very different things. One of my favorite websites has been this small initiative, 91-DIVOC, or it's COVID-19 spelled backwards, which lets you compare data and then manipulate it to say, well, let me do it on a per capita basis. Well, let me do it looking at death rates. Let me look at hospitalizations. Let me look at vaccinations and compare it over time. I think that's very useful because often when things are communicated, whether in media or elsewhere, to be clear or as part of an index, we're just using one of those metrics. And not only that, COVID has been useful because we often look at the country level, and for something like the Global Cybersecurity Index, that makes sense because we're looking at what the national government is doing. But cybersecurity occurs at every level, down to the individual. And if you take some of these big countries, the differences between provinces, as you can probably tell by my accent, I have some ties to the United States, between states can vary dramatically. And so when we're then looking at what kind of interventions do we want to take, you need to tailor that to what does that context look like. And this is going to be true for the United States, India, China, even France, because an index isn't a magic bullet. It must be used carefully. And also, let's be honest, depending on how we weight indicators, how we interpolate missing data, how we select our data, we can dramatically shift what that final number looks like.
Carol,
so we want to be clear.
You mentioned several times the pandemic. Did it impact on the indexes? Do we see a disruption in the assessment methodology or in the results? Shall we expect a drastic, dramatic change in the next ITU index for Africa, for example, after 2 years of pandemic? So, for my own part, I'm expecting this next index, and in order to see the changes, and I'm expecting huge changes. Do you agree with that?
I don't know if the changes will be large, but in some ways it's been negative. We were doing data collection during the pandemic, and many countries came back to us saying, we can't get an answer on these specific questions. We can't provide you any data or provide you any updates on what's going on.
So we are going to have a lot of question marks, and that might be an information in itself. I mean, the lack of information is an information. That's
very, very true. Okay. I think it's also been an opportunity, though, because it's highlighted the importance of ICT for a lot of these governments, and it's moved it up on a lot of agendas. So I'm optimistic, I try to be optimistic in these situations, that hopefully the governments will be able to use the pandemic as a way to continue prioritizing ICT, and as part of that, the cybersecurity of that ICT to make it more resilient in the long term.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Just in time, maybe a short conclusion. Clara, if you have a very short conclusion, if you are still with us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I will actually look at what Caroline just sort of said. You know, when we're looking at sort of indices and then building indexes out of them, I think a lot of what we are, looking at, and we're basing a lot of our conclusion on certain assumptions. For example, that the fact that a country has a strategy doesn't necessarily mean that they have taken the necessary step to operationalize it or measures to implement it, or that those measures had a certain impact. So I really would, want for the community a takeaway to be that, there needs to be a focus on the impact of those measures taken based on those indices, those gaps identified, and especially focus on impact in terms of societal harm. So to understand whether the way the indices or the index or how the government operationalize it is actually having impact on preventing societal harm. So I think there is a lot of work to be done to complement technical analysis and to look at, how we can actually measure that harm and whether the way governments are implementing their commitments and what they have been indicated they have to do, whether there is actually having any impact down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara, for this conclusion focused on impact. David, your conclusion, very short, 1 minute, if you can. It's all yours.
Yes, thank you, Dominic. So very shortly, I think what we will see is that several assessment tools that we have right now will develop even more, will become better. At the same time, we probably also see on a more local level new assessments, and that I think is really important. But I think that was a little bit the conclusion maybe of today as well. Like if you look at it right now where we are, I think the assessments are a starting point for discussion, to reach out, and from then take it from there. And so that's why we make use of several assessments and see how we can get the picture as clear as possible and then start from there.
Thank you, David. Sébastien.
Yes,
your conclusion.
Yes, well, we have seen that we can see a lot of different initiatives. So the cyber rating is really there as a huge trend. We can see it at country level. We can see it, let's say, at a company level. So we are just highlighting that for sure there is it's a kind of nitroglycerin, or let's say
dynamite.
Dynamite. So let's say that it's a very sensitive information. It has been highlighted by the panel. So I think it's important to really explain what does mean, let's say, the cyber rating in terms of how has it been built. So we can see a clear sovereignty concern over there, definitely, because we are facing an assessment, so we need to manage how the assessment is achieved, definitely, and for sure, let's go for more discussion, standardization on that topic in order to commonly agree how is it built, how is it, let's say, how the technical facts are reported, and I think that's it. Thank you, Dominique.
Yes, thank you, Sébastien. Caroline, you'll have the last word very shortly. Thank you.
I think my fellow speakers have made most of the points I want to make. These are a scaffold for us to help us understand cybersecurity, but it's discussions that we're having now to figure out how things are going to change in the future and what we need to understand for the future that really matter. So this is a great place to continue that discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the members of this brilliant panel. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.